I think we should all feel very blessed that we live in these times, despite the hardships, despite the coronavirus and so on. But we are really learning to listen to the voice of the earth. And you can look at that scientifically, that the skies are clearing when there's not, there's not a lot of industrial activity going on. That's scientific. You can measure it. Or you can look at it like Maria Juana, the shaman, did and say it's Pachamama, living earth, speaking to you. It doesn't matter, but whatever it is, these messages are very, very strong. We have to change. And you and I and all your listeners are blessed to be living at this time when we can make this happen.
That's John Perkins, up next on the All Things Risk podcast. Hey, welcome back, everyone, to the All Things Risk podcast. This is your host, Ben Catania. It's wonderful to have you join us once again. And today we welcome back John Perkins to the show. He was our guest on episode 51 way back then, and it's a perfect time to have him back. If you are new to John, he is the author of the New York Times bestseller Confessions of an Economic Hitman, as well as other books on the global economy. He was the chief economist at a major international consulting firm. He's worked with the World Bank, the UN, several Fortune 500 companies, and he has written and spoken extensively on US imperialism and the failing of the so-called death economy. But there is another fascinating side to John. John has studied shamanism for decades, dating back to his time in the Amazon when he was with the Peace Corps back in the late 1960s. And John is also the founder and a board member at Dream Change and the Pachamama Alliance, both of which are non-profit organizations devoted to establishing a world future generations will want to inherit. And John's most recent book is called Touching the Jaguar, Transforming Fear into Action to Change Your Life and the World. Now, this is a book in which John combines his background in the global economy with his expertise in shamanism and healing and in indigenous wisdom. And I love this kind of stuff. In fact, on All Things Risk, we absolutely believe that wonderful insights and great directions and just great things happen when domains and areas of expertise are combined. We just need more of that. And John provides that with his book and this conversation. And I found this episode to be quite inspiring. And that's also something that we need more of: genuine, authentic, yet grounded and wise inspiration. So John and I discuss all of those things, and John's messages are very pertinent to all of the things that are going on in the world right now. We discuss his background as a so-called economic hitman, shamanism, healing, ayahuasca, and this new trend towards increasing use of ayahuasca. But the bulk of this conversation is about fear and our perceptions. And this is what the metaphor of touching the jaguar is all about. And John also describes an exercise we can all do to help us make change happen. And we get into lots more. So let's get into it. Here is John Perkins. John, welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. It's a pleasure to have you back on, and I loved our previous chat, and I'm really looking forward to this.
Thank you, Ben. It's great to be with you again, and I'm very much looking forward to it. Also, thank you for all the good work you're doing in the world.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What I wanted to do before we dive into your new book is, for some of my listeners who may be new to you, if you could just give a little bit of a background as to who you are and your journey and how, I suppose, you got to this current point.
Well, yes, I'd be happy to. It's a long journey, so I'll try to just quickly summarize it, and then we can go back to any particular areas you're most interested in. After I graduated from business school, I joined the Peace Corps, was sent deep into the Amazon rainforest. A shaman saved my life at one point there, and basically then required that I become his apprentice because he'd saved my life. And what I learned in that process was that shamanism there, and then later I studied in places like Indonesia and Iran and Egypt and many other places, and all over the world, it's based on the idea that our perceptions mold or create our reality as human beings. And as it turns out, that's also the premise for modern psychotherapy, for quantum physics, for advertising, basically everything. When you come right down to it, Ben, there is no United States, there's no Canada, there's no culture, there's no religion, there are no corporations. There's almost nothing regarding human activities that isn't first perceived. And when enough people accept a perception or codify it into law, it has a huge impact on reality. Anyway, that was part of the teaching in the shaman area. And then after I got out of the Peace Corps, I did what I'd been trained to do in business school. I became an economist. Pretty quickly after that, chief economist at a major international consulting firm, really what was known as an economic hitman. Did that for 10 years and then saw the mistakes that we were making in that area and how we were creating a failed system. And again, that whole system is based on a perception that the goal of corporations and the goal of basically human beings in the modern world is to maximize short-term materialistic benefits or short-term profits for corporations. And so I quit, and I, after 10 years, and went back to the Amazon and ended up writing 5 books on shamanism and forming a couple of nonprofits that work in that area, and then wrote the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and 3 other books on global economics and intrigue, and they were all very big-time bestsellers. And then decided that I needed to bring those 2 genres together. To me, they were always the indigenous, the shaman, and the corporate, and that's why I wrote the most recent book, Touching the Jaguar, which does that.
Mm-hmm. Could we talk a little bit about your previous life as an economic hitman and what that means? Because I think so much of this, of your current book, is really based on the coming together, the merging. You have this wonderful Mayan parable, I guess, of the eagle and the condor, and I suppose the eagle is your life as an economic hitman. Maybe before we get into the eagle and the condor, we could if you could just describe what that means in terms of this global economic system that you were a part of and facilitated, and perhaps we're still in. What does that mean when we say economic hitman? That sounds like something out of a movie.
Yeah, it does. And it was kind of like some movies. Well, my official title was chief economist, but my job was to identify countries that have resources our corporations want, like oil. And I had a large staff, anywhere from 30 to 50 people at various times to help me do this. But I would go to these countries, and we'd identify countries that had resources our corporations wanted. And then I'd convince the president of that country or the minister of finance or whoever I needed to, that they needed to sign off on huge loans from the World Bank or their sister organizations. And the money never actually went to the country. The country was in debt for the money. They posted their resource, oil, whatever, as collateral. The money actually went to our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects in those countries. Things like electric power systems, industrial parks, highways, ports, things like that ultimately, when I first got into this and started doing that, I thought I was doing a really good thing, because in business school, you're taught that if you want to help a poor country, you invest a lot of money into infrastructure. And that raises the economy. The GDP you see grows. And statistically, we can show that happens. But what I began to realize the further I got into this is that those statistics are extremely skewed in favor of the rich. So what we're really doing was building these projects that benefited rich families that own the industries, that own the commercial establishments, the banks. They benefited from these big infrastructure projects. But the majority of the people suffered because money was diverted from healthcare, education, other social services to pay off the interest on the debts. And in the long run, the principal will never be repaid. And so at some point we go back and say, usually under the auspices of the International Monetary Fund, hey, we'll help you restructure your loan, but you got to sell your resource, oil, whatever, real cheap to our corporations without any environmental or social regulations, or allow us to build a military base on your soil, things like this. And so over time, I began to see that the system was very, very skewed. And the statistics around GDP are very, they're not valid statistics to use if you're looking for general prosperity of the overall population. They really measure how the rich are doing more than anything else.
And I suppose this is a system that's been centuries, millennia old, because it's empire, isn't it?
It is. It's the idea of debt, and there's another side to this system, and that is if these presidents or whoever we're dealing with didn't agree to these deals, they were very aware that there were jackals, what we call jackals, standing in the background. These are usually CIA assets or ex-CIA or whatever, and these are people that would come in and overthrow a government or assassinate its leader if they didn't play the game. And, the United States, unfortunately, we've admitted to doing this. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger admitted that we did such things in Chile with Salvador Allende, President Allende, and Arbenz of Guatemala, and Mossadegh of Iran, and Lumumba of the Congo, on and on and on. We have this. So, in a way, my job was somewhat easy because I could go to a president of a country and say, hey, take this loan, sign off on this loan, and you and your buddies, the rich families, you're going to benefit. And if you don't sign off on the loans, you're probably going to be taken out in a coup, possibly even assassinated. And so, that's it's a fairly easy decision for most presidents to make. In a couple of cases, I had presidents, the democratically elected president of Ecuador, Jaime Roldos, and head of state of Panama, Omar Torrijos, that had integrity. They didn't buy into these deals, and they were both taken out in private airplane crashes that were, I have no doubt, and most of the world has no doubt, were assassinations.
And when your book, when Confessions came out, or shortly thereafter, I think the State Department issued some sort of a statement saying this is fiction and there's no proof that this is the system and we don't employ jackals and this kind of thing. But I think a lot has come out since that time.
That was kind of comical in a way because, yes, they created a new website that hadn't existed before called the Misinformation website. And I was the only person on it. My book was the only thing on it. And it sold a lot of books for me. And so their whole premise was that I claimed that I had been recruited by the National Security Agency, which is true. But they quoted the mission statement of the NSA, which was that all it does is cryptography, encoding and decoding messages. And of course, everybody knew that was not true. We knew about the Pueblo, this ship, that had been taken captive, and so we knew all these things. And of course, since then, with Edward Snowden and others, it's become very obvious that the National Security Agency does some very, very dark work. But so the State Department came out with a statement. It was a fairly brief statement. It didn't get into the jackals very much or anything. It just said my book can't possibly be true because it's based on the false premise that I was recruited by an agency that doesn't recruit people like that, which was a lie. And I always wonder, why did they do this? Because it sold a lot of books. And I did one year a television show for a big show in Athens, Greece. It was considered to be the 60 Minutes of Greece. And the next year they came back. They did this in the United States. They came to my place here. And the next year they came back and to do another one because the producer said it was the most popular show they had. And he said, "Have you noticed that misinformation site for the State Department?" And I said, "Of course." And he said, "Do you wonder why it's there?" And I said, "Well, yeah, it's selling a lot of books for me. It seems to be accomplishing the opposite. But you think they want to?" He says, "I know why it's there." He said, after I did the program where we interviewed you in Athens, the U.S. ambassador called me into the embassy, called me into his office, and chewed me out for doing this. And I said, "Well, I would think you'd be proud that in your country people can speak such things." And he said, "Yeah, but it caused huge embarrassment for me because people coming in, politicians and businessmen, and saying, 'Hey, is this book true? What's your opinion of this book? Is it true?' And he said, 'I frankly don't know what to say.' And I went back to the State Department and asked them. And he said, 'I think a lot of other diplomats around the world were in the same position.' And so the State Department felt they had to issue a statement that the diplomats around the world could just say, 'Hey, go to the website. Here's the official position.' Right. I'm not going to express my opinion.
Right.
Here's the position." It was hilarious. And since then the book was vetted by the New York Times and a number of others. My publishers vetted it, and today there's no question. I don't get those questions at all about its authenticity anymore.
Mm-hmm. What do you make of the way China's going about international relations right now? Do you think that they're following a millennia-old system or set of practices? What's your take on that?
They are, and I spend a lot of time in Latin America these days. Well, not in the last couple of months, but and I talk to a lot of people in power, and they're saying that they'd much rather take loans from China or the Chinese banks than from the World Bank and the other ones associated with the United States. And the biggest reason they give is that, China's never assassinated one of our leaders or overthrown a government. China's never. China doesn't have a military presence in Latin America, and I'll say, but don't you think their objectives are the same to getting your resources? Yeah, probably, but they answer. But we don't have the technology for going after these resources. So we have to strike a deal with someone, and their opinion right now is that, to a large degree, is that China is a safer bet than the United States. And I think, Ben, incidentally, that's extremely unfortunate. I think we made huge mistakes by doing some of the things we did because we should be doing that, and we just opened the door to Chinese exploitation in these countries.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting. Well, I want to actually talk about your journey into shamanism as well here. And in your book, you describe this and you talk about things you don't talk about in Confessions. So you were introduced to shamanism, as you said, during your time in the Peace Corps. And did you continue practicing it? Well, maybe just describe that a little bit, but also did you continue practicing it during your time in the 1970s when you were working for it's CT Maine, I believe it was the company that you work for. So could you just talk about your journey into shamanism?
Well, yes, I was. So I'm in the Peace Corps, deep in the Amazon rainforest, in what's called Shuar territory, the Shuar hunters and gatherers at that time, and living very earth-based lives, very close to nature. What I would have at the time defined as primitive, and I wouldn't define it that way anymore. But I get very ill at one point. This is 1969. I was dying. I couldn't keep any food down. I couldn't stand up by myself. It would just take me 3 days, including a very difficult hike through dense jungle, to get to the nearest medical facility. There's no way I could do that. And one night a shaman offered to heal me, and I didn't even know what a shaman was. I wasn't even familiar with the word. But it was my only option. And so I did it. And that night, he took me into what we call a shamanic journey, or a trance state, a vision quest, if you will, all night long. And And at one point, there was this. I've got my eyes closed. He's chanting, and I'm in this altered state, and I see this amorphous form in front of me, and he says, "Touch the jaguar." Well, I freaked out. I'm in the middle of the jungle. I look all around. I open my eyes and I look around. Where's the jaguar? Like, oh my God, we gotta get out of here. And he says, no, close your eyes. Touch. Do you see the jaguar in front of you? Touch it. And that this amorphous form became a jaguar's face. And I reached out in the vision and touched it. And what I heard was a voice like my mother's saying, "The food and drink here will kill you." And I realized at that moment, I mean, so the people in the Amazon don't drink water, for example, of other rivers, because they know the rivers are filled with organic matter, falling trees, etc. And so the women make a kind of beer called chicha by chewing and spitting manioc root. And it sets up a fermentation process, alcohol. And you can add water to it, and it's safe to drink. And so they eat very strange foods, in my opinion, squirming white grubs that alive, and so I realized that while I'm in this trance, what I realized is that every time I was eating these foods and drinking this spit beer, I heard a voice saying, "It'll kill you," and so I was getting very, very ill. At the same time, I saw that the Shuar themselves are very robust, very healthy, very vital. They're incredibly healthy people, and many live to be very old if they're not killed in a hunting accident. And so that night, I saw that it was not the food and drink killing me. It was my perception. And I got healthy quickly. The shaman, as I said earlier, demanded I become his apprentice. And what I learned in that process was that perception controls reality, and for human beings. And so then I got out of the Peace Corps. I was in for 3 years. I studied there in the Amazon with the shaman, and then later I spent a year up in the Andes studying with the Quechua shaman. And in answer to the other question, then I went into economics. But as I traveled around the world, I tried to take time off and spend time with shamans in many different cultures in Asia and Europe and Latin America and parts of Africa. And but I had to do that totally in secret, because
how did you do that? How did you find these shaman? And maybe it might be interesting just to explain or give an anecdote or two of some of the shamanic practices you came across in Africa or Asia or places like that. Like, how would you go about doing that?
Well, so I now spoke what you might call the shamanic language, which was this understanding of perception. And these people are very intuitive people. So if I was in a country, let's say Indonesia, where I actually learned to speak the language a little bit, Bahasa Indonesia, or as in Iran, or wherever I was, I would let the word get out that I was really interested in meeting. And sometimes you just call them wise elders, sometimes you call them the local priests, whatever, And the word would get out, and usually then they would basically find me or help me find them. And they understood that I got what they were doing. And, part of what this whole process is, Ben, is that every culture, so the basic principle of shamanism of using perception to change reality is maintained throughout. But the way that's communicated changes radically. So in places like the Amazon, they use what they call sacred plants to do this. In the Andes, they use volcanic rocks that they rub around your body and eggs and other things. In various parts of the world, there's different rituals, different ways of communicating how to change your perception, to change your reality. In the United States and Europe and places, we do it through language. So, basically psychotherapists work through with language because that's what we're comfortable with. And sometimes these days psychotherapists will go into hypnosis and to do a little shamanic journey, but it's basically all with words. So these various cultures have different means of communicating, but when you come right down to it, the premise is all the same, that our reality is created by our perceptions as human beings.
Yeah, I think when you talk about psychotherapy and psychology, this is, anyone who's been in therapy or who's read any books on psychology, the importance of the stories we tell ourselves, right? That the stories you tell yourself about yourself and the world, etc., is it's a very powerful thing to notice, etc., etc. So that's all about perception, isn't it?
It is, so. Part of my job as an economic hitman was to create a system which now is failing us, and it's a system that a lot of economists are increasingly referring to as a death economy. And it's not just the economy; it's a governmental, social, environmental, economic system that is destroying itself. It's based on the perception that the goal of the business is to maximize short-term profits regardless of the social and environmental costs. The goal of the rest of us should be to maximize our short-term material consumption. And
right.
That's a fairly recent perception of what it means to be human on this planet. But it is the prevailing perception, and it's created this system that just plain isn't working. And if we use the shaman, I've always realized that there was a connection between the 5 books I've written on shamanism and the 4 I've written on global economics, but most people didn't see that connection. And so I've written Touching the Jaguar to make that bridge. And it goes back to that saying that the shamans touch that jaguar. Basically, what he was saying is go out and touch your fear. Don't run from your fear anymore. And my fear in that case came from this voice that said that the food and drink is killing you. So I was very fearful of the food and drink. Once I touched that and saw that that this food and drink was really very healthy. I mean, in our terms today, you say it's organic and local and highly nutritious. But so once I saw that it changed everything. And we can apply that same principle to the economy. So if we look at our current world, we could say that the starting reality is the world is filled with natural and human resources. If you apply to that the perception and what the shamans would call, you put a perception bridge in there that says these resources should be used to maximize short-term profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs. You reach a death economy, an economic system that's destroying itself. But if you change that perception and you say, no, the goal should be to use these natural and human resources to maximize long-term benefits for people and nature, then you arrive at a new reality, which is what we call a life economy, an economic system where we would pay people, investors would make rates of return by hiring people to clean up pollution, to create new systems for regenerating destroyed environments, for recycling, for new energy forms and communications forms, and so on and so forth. And we've been in the process of doing that. But in order to make that change in the perception, there's a jaguar standing on that bridge. And so when you start to cross that bridge and you try to change the idea that we need to maximize short-term profits, the jaguar says, oh, no, you can't do that, that you can't change. We got to keep moving in the direction we've been moving. And this is the proven system, this form of capitalism, what we call predatory capitalism. The jaguar stands there, but if we touch it, then the jaguar says, oh, wait, there is a way to change. And that's simply we change the defining principle. And we have the success stories not be about executives and other people who maximize short-term gains, but we put on the Time magazine cover of the person of the year becomes the person that's made the most money or done something like that. It becomes the person that's done the greatest good for the long-term benefit of people and the planet and nature. And there we move into a new reality, and that's really using the whole basics of shamanism or marketing, for that matter.
Right. One of the things that certainly comes out at various points in your book when you describe your experiences in the Amazon is how the people there lived in harmony with their environment. Whether one of the things that struck me was the I think it was the sap of a particular tree that's used as a natural anesthetic, for instance. I can't remember that part of the book specifically, but there are all these examples of the people there using the resources around them, but in a sustainable kind of harmonious way versus as you say, a predatory way. And similarly, what's interesting is these ceremonies of ayahuasca, for example, and how did these people come to understand that these plants had these healing powers, for example. It's quite extraordinary.
It is, yeah. So for those who are familiar with ayahuasca, it's actually a combination of a couple of plants, a vine called Manastorosaurus caipe, and it's a technical term, and it's always combined with some other plant. There's many other different plants that could be used, but always one or the other is used depending on where in the Amazon you are. And people talk about it as being a drug. It's not a hallucinogenic. I don't think it's either. It's a sacred plant that takes us into a new reality. So a drug or hallucinogenic, in my opinion, takes us out of reality. I'd put television in that category. But this plant opens you to a new way of looking at things often, and it's by no means the only way. It's become a kind of a chic thing to do in many parts of the world today.
Yeah. I wanted to get your take on what you think of that as well. It seems to be having a moment now, but sorry, continue. I think I interrupted your flow there.
Yeah, no, but it's it's an amazing plant. I was trained in the Amazon as an ayahuasca shaman. I'm very familiar with the plant. It's an incredible plant, but it's only one way to enter this, what you might call a portal to another way of perceiving, into looking at reality, into influencing reality. And I teach workshops now around the world where I take people on shamanic journeys that are very similar to using ayahuasca, where you don't use a plant, you use a drum, you use a voice, you take people. And, there's so many different ways. As I said, shamans around the world have very different ways of communicating. In the Amazon, the sacred plant is important. But in most shamanic cultures, they don't use anything like that, and you don't need it. But it is one method to open, and it can be a very powerful, and it can be a fairly quick course to opening. But I think there's a real problem, too, in the United States. From what I've never taken it here. I've only used it in the Amazon with shamans there. But from what I understand, people will take it and they'll have some sort of experience and they'll want to have another one. They want to repeat it and they'll keep going. The other day, somebody said to me, "How many times have you taken ayahuasca this year?" I did it 20 times. And I'm like, oh, my God.
Wow.
The last time I did it was 10 years ago, and I'm still processing that. So with all of these things, whether it's a shamanic journey, whether you're using rattles, whether you're using chanting, whether you're using the voice of a psychotherapist, whatever it is, it takes more than just that one experience. And the same can be said for ayahuasca. You take it, but you get to then work with what you learn in that process. And that's the important part of it. And I fear that in some cases, at least in places like the United States and Europe today, and parts of South America, it's being seen as some sort of a placebo. And all you got to do is take it, and then take it again and again, and everything's going to work out all right. But that's just not the case.
Yeah, it strikes me that the way I've never taken it, so I don't really know, but it strikes me that it's having a moment, but that many are talking about it in the same way that you would talk about a prescription drug or something, and that doesn't seem to me like what you describe in terms of a way of changing your perception, and that the solution, the magic bullet to my problems is to take this thing and to go and to take it whenever I have a problem X. And it strikes me as that's not really changing your perceptions. Is actually you coming into it with a mindset of like you're going to the local pharmacy and getting a prescription filled out for whatever drug.
Yeah, it's a good analogy because you hear people these days criticizing the pharmaceutical industry as being more concerned with healing or dealing with symptoms and not with the cause of the disease, because they can't make money off getting rid of the disease. They want to keep you in the disease, but keep you symptom-free so that you're happy. And you got to keep taking the drop. And I think people who look at like, oh, I got to take it 20 times this year. There's an Alaska party, next Saturday night. I think I got to go to that. That's a little bit in that same line that you're constantly looking for a short-term hive of some sort. Whereas the way it's used by indigenous cultures that I've been with in the Amazon, it's very, very different. And the way I've used it is, you take it, you have an experience, and then you deal with that experience. And it can be a very unpleasant experience sometimes. You may be forced to look at something you've really not wanted to look at all your life, like a parent that abused you, and you shoved it into your subconscious, but now it comes out, but you need to deal with that, and it's not just that night. That night shows you what you got to deal with. It can also be a beautiful experience some people have, and then they want to repeat that, but that's not good either. You got to take, what have you learned from this beautiful experience, and where does that take you next? And so it requires some work. And in the book Touching the Jaguar, I outline this daily practice that people can do, and they don't have to do it every day, once a week for 10 minutes or so. And if you do that, you're going to arrive at the same place as if you took ayahuasca. But in both cases, you're going to have to work on it. In the case of the ayahuasca, you may somehow convince yourself, you may give yourself the perception, or other people may give you the perception that all you got to do is take it, and that's the magic bullet. But that's just not the case.
I want to get into that as well. To go back to another, these are all related topics, obviously, but when you're talking about this sort of short-termism and the death economy and moving to this idea of a life economy and the change in perception that we need, I forget there's a talk, and I forget who it was. I think it's Harvard business professor. It may be Clay Christensen, but it's all about the metrics that most companies have around. They're all short-term metrics, and how that is a barrier to long-term investments, R&D into technologies that could be more sustainable, more life-saving. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. We talked about a death economy, but what is a life economy, and what does that look like, and what are some of the ways in which we as a species can get there?
Well, yeah, so that's a big question, and let me start by giving you an example. So let's say that over $50 of every $100 you pay in taxes in the United States, over 50, around $52, $53 goes to military, basically, and that goes to industry that support military, a lot of it. So imagine if some of that money, that 50%, or so at least part of it, were paid Raytheon or General Dynamics to, instead of making tanks and missiles and aircraft carriers and so forth, to instead make equipment and come up with processes that mine all the plastic in the oceans and recycle it, or mine all the oil leaked out of gas stations all over the world and oil production facilities. So you pay those same engineers that work for those companies out of our tax dollars to do something that really makes the world a better place. And we could pay people to clean up all the pollution, to regenerate all the terribly destroyed environments on this planet, a heck of a lot of them. And, we've been going into more and more solar and wind. We brought down the price of solar from like $66 a kilowatt back 20 years ago or so to 66 cents now. But we've still got a ways to go. I mean, hopefully 10 years from now, the technologies we have today will look archaic. We'll be advancing. We'll be moving forward. But that takes investment, and let's invest in that. That's a long-term investment. So there's an example. You hire these companies, or you hire individuals, or you encourage entrepreneurs to come up with new companies that do this. And in fact, that's been going on. B corporations, benefit corporations, conscious capitalism movement, the Green New Deal. In the last August, 192 of the world's most powerful, most successful executives of the big corporations came together at the business roundtable and came up with a statement that basically said we need to support a life economy. We can't just maximize short-term profits. We need to look to help our employees get better insurance and retirement. We need to help our customers get better service. We need to help our suppliers do better. And we need to help the communities where we work. That was a statement they came up with. So there's been this movement in that direction. And I'm hoping that this coronavirus, that despite how terrible it is and how much suffering it causes, will open us to more of these processes where we do things like what you and I are doing right now, virtually, rather than flying off to meet with each other someplace, or have me fly to your studio or whatever. We can do it this way. There's so much like this that's going on. So I think, we're moving in that direction. We can continue. And as to what people can do, and again, the book goes into specifics for whether whatever you are, a carpenter or a plumber or a teacher, but you can have this daily practice, and the book goes, and we can pursue that more if you want. But I think part of it is.
Let's go ahead.
Well, part of it is that I've met with a lot of executives who tell me, I want our company to do a much better job. I want us to be greener. But I know, and this addresses been the other issue you raised, but I know that if I lose 0.5% of market share or the stock prices go down, I'll lose my job. My main investors will fire me, and they'll replace me with someone who doesn't give a damn about being green. They only care about market share or stock prices. So get all your people. They'll say to me, when you're out there speaking, John Perkins, Ben, when you're out there doing your programs, tell everybody that's listening, hey, pick a company that you don't like what they're doing. You want to see them do better. I don't care whether it's Exxon or Walmart or Nike or whatever it is. Pick a company and then start a consumer campaign or join one. And now with social media, it's so much easier. You can reach thousands and thousands of people and ask them all to send a letter to these companies or in text or post, whatever it is, saying, I love your product, but I'm not going to buy it anymore until you pay your workers in India a fair salary or clean up the pollution you've caused or whatever. And share that with all your social networking circles. Ask them to share it with all of theirs. And these executives will tell me, I want to get these kinds of notices, and I can take these to my primary investors and say, hey, we've got to change. We've got to listen to our customers. These are our customers speaking.
There is something happening, undoubtedly. And changes, perhaps, sometimes we don't feel it, right? Because we've got quite the opposite feeling, I think, many of us at the moment, given what's happened in the U.S. with the murder of George Floyd and the riots and obviously the coronavirus. But coronavirus is another, the other dimension there is that this is a virus that migrated from animals to humans. So things like the wildlife trade and these kinds of things, we need to rethink that because it will have more of these types of pandemics unless we alter the way we interact with nature. And I think
it's fair. I think it's fair to say the planet is speaking to us. And you can look at it from a scientific standpoint. You can look at it from a shamanic standpoint. I recall a number of years ago, and this is in the book, so you've probably just read it, a shaman lady up in the high Andes, a Quechua woman with the wonderful name of Maria Juana. And I was there. I took a group of people to meet with her, and I take groups of people. You can go to my website to find out more at johnperkins.org, but I take groups of people to spend time with shamans in Latin America. And we were with her, and somebody asked, so how do we save Mother Earth? And she laughs and she says, well, Mother Earth's not in danger. We humans are, and we're taking each other species with us. But, we're just like so many fleas. And if we get to be too much of a nuisance, Pachamama, Mother Earth will just shake us off. And then I want to point this volcano that hovers over her house in Mabura. And she says, that mountain was, a few years ago, was covered with a thick ice cap. It isn't anymore. Pachamama's twitching. She's sending us a message, and we better listen. And I'll tell you, Ben, every time we've had a major hurricane or earthquake or tsunami or these fires that are going in Australia and California and other places, I thought of that statement and thought, well, the Earth really is sending us a message. And but the problem was that we were taking it as local. So if you survived the hurricane, you expected the outside world to come to your rescue soon, bringing water and food and so on. And then you thought you'd move on and do things the way you'd been doing it all along. Rather than really understanding that we can't continue to build the way we build, to live the way we live. And this coronavirus now has sent a really strong global message. There is no outside world to come to our help. I think it's a very strong message, that, and the fact that it comes out of animals, yes, that the natural world is speaking to us, whether you want to look at our interest in plants like ayahuasca or our growing interest in organic foods, in vegetarianism, even veganism. There's a whole thing that's rising. I think there's a new consciousness on the planet. Human beings, we're feeling this consciousness. And the coronavirus is pushing us one step further toward realizing we have to change. That's the jaguar we have to touch. We have to get out of this economy and transform it into a life economy. And every one of us has a role to play in that. And this virus is giving us the time to think about that and to have these conversations and to look at what we do next.
How would you also position the touching the jaguar analogy to what's happening in the U.S. with the riots that, this week, there are riots that are happening in the U.S. and protests that are happening all over the world because of the police brutality in the U.S. And this is not something that's exclusive to the U.S. Police brutality and racism exists around the world. But how would you position the touching the jaguar analogy in relation to that?
Yes, and it has a big bearing, being in the United States, a country that in its sacred papers says all people are created equal, and ourselves on that over the centuries, and it's been a lie. And I grew up in the 60s. I was in college in the 60s. I joined the Peace Corps in the 60s. And back then, we all knew it was terrible discrimination. And there were these race riots then, and Martin Luther King and the Black Panthers all came forward. And then it's like we forgot about it. We didn't exactly forget, but it went on the back burner. And it's coming up again, and it needs to come up. I mean, it's terribly, terribly important that we understand that I am a privileged white male. There's no question. I didn't do anything to make that happen to me. I was born that way, but I certainly experienced lots of privileges as a white male American. And it's really important to understand that. And it's really important to understand the other side of the picture, that those people who don't experience that, they are in deep trouble, and there's tremendous resentment and anger. And so, and I don't think it's a coincidence that it happens at this time of the coronavirus, because this virus has pointed out to us that it's the people of color, it's the minority groups in this country that have suffered the most because of the virus, and the economic problems that have occurred. So these two things really go hand in hand, and they're both these very strong messages that we have to change. We have to change what it means to be human on this planet. We have to become more socially responsible and more environmentally responsible, and we have to live lives that reflect that as citizens of this planet.
Yeah, that's very beautifully put. I want to get into this practice that's in your book, and maybe if you could just give us a little bit of an overview around this practice about how to make change happen. Where did it come from? And maybe if you could give us a little overview of what it is, that would be very helpful.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so I can quickly summarize it, and in 5 questions, and I'll give a personal example to illustrate. So the first question we ask ourselves is, what do I most want to do for the rest of my life? What will bring me the greatest joy, the greatest satisfaction, the greatest bliss? For me, I love to write. I want to write. And the second question is, how do I tie this in with helping other people? Maybe it's one other person in your family, or maybe it's the whole world. But we know that people are happier when they also help other people and they support other people. So for me as a writer, I say, okay, so I'm going to write stories that inspire people to transform a death economy into a life economy. That's my idea. The question number 3 is, what's stopping you from doing this? What's the Jaguar standing in your path? And I had a Jaguar back, there's been many as a writer over the years, but the first one really was, I'd been a good writer in high school. I was editor of the newspaper, won a short story prize. And when I went to college, I had a teacher who was very well known as a writer, and I had a great admiration for him, and he criticized my work terribly, never gave me anything above a C. It hurt. I quit school because of that. And I eventually went back, but I didn't major in English. I majored in economics and business administration. I didn't want to have anything to do with writing. And so that was this Jaguar that stood in my path, this voice from this authority figure who said, you're no good. And so the fourth question, how do we touch that Jaguar? How do we change our perceptions to allow us to move forward with what we most want to do? And for me, it was suddenly I realized, well, this is just a guy. That's his opinion. And he's not an authority necessarily. He may be a published author. But then I remembered that he criticized Bob Dylan for his writing.
Right.
And Bob, yeah, and Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize in Literature, for goodness sake. So the Jaguar was, well, this is just one voice. He doesn't not like your writing, but that doesn't matter. So you're a good writer, right? And so the fifth question is, what do I do? What action do I take every day? And for me as a writer, it's you write. And you can apply this to anything. A carpenter can say, I love to work. The question number 1, what do I most want to do with my life? I want to do carpentry work. I love doing it. How do I relate that to a bigger issue? I use sustainable materials whenever possible. What's the barrier standing in the way? My customers are going to say, sustainable materials may cost me more. I don't want to spend the extra money. And what's the Jaguar touch? The Jaguar tells you, change that perception. It's not a cost. When you buy sustainable, when you use sustainable products, you're investing in the future for yourself and your children and your grandchildren. And then what's the action you take every day? You go out and you tell customers you're going to do this, and you go to work doing it. And so, this process, and then it boils down to a thing we can do for 10 minutes every day. So each person can answer those questions in suggest in one sentence, each of those questions, answer that. And they're going to change. As you move forward, you confront one barrier, you overcome it, and then you'll find more barriers. I'm sure as a podcast host, Ben, you've run into plenty of barriers.
All the time. Yeah. All the time. Yeah.
If we take 5 minutes every day or every 2 days or once a week or whatever and really go into this process, it can change our lives. And it's the whole idea of transforming fear, the fear that we can't do it, into action to change your life and the world is the subtitle of the book, Touching the Jaguar. That's the subtitle, and that's what it's all about. It's a pretty simple process.
Yeah.
And it's also very powerful.
Yeah, and not easy, but then again, nothing's that's worthwhile is easy.
Well, you make it easy. So I mean, the daily actions can be something as simple as a tweet or writing another paragraph in the book, or it can be as complex as running for president.
Yeah. We one of the things I did mention that we didn't get a chance to have you explain is this eagle and condor analogy. Could you just quickly summarize that for us?
It's a very old prophecy that came out of the Amazon and the Andes, moved up to Central America, and it basically says, back in the midst of history, and this was said back probably 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, they were saying, back in the midst of history, human beings decided to take 2 different routes, our societies did. One was the route of the condor, which it was said was the route of the heart, of passion, of intuition, of creativity. We might even call it the feminine route. And the other was the route of the eagle, which was said the route of the mind, of the intellect, of industry, of rationalization, of maybe even the male route. And it was said that these 2 societies, these two paths would go in the separate directions for a long, long time. And then it was said that in the fourth Pachacuti, and Pachacuti and Quechua, the language of the Andes, is a 500-year interval. In the fourth Pachacuti, which began about 1500, the eagle and condor would come together and clash, and the eagle would be so strong as to practically drive the condor into extinction, but not quite. And of course, we know that's happened. 1492, Columbus. After that, the industrialized countries of the societies of the world practically drove the indigenous societies into extinction, but not quite. The prophecy goes on to say that in the fifth Pachacuti, 500 years later, roughly the year 2000, the opportunity arises for the eagle and the condor to fly in one sky together, to dance, to mate, and to create a new offspring, which is higher consciousness. And we've been seeing that happen since the 90s, and so we've seen a much greater interest in shamanism amongst our people. That's when I started writing books about shamanism, and people were buying them. And we also saw the indigenous people saying, we need to share this knowledge with our brothers and sisters in the Eagle Land. So we need to come together so that we bring heart and mind together and create higher consciousness out of that. So it's a beautiful prophecy. And incidentally, there's prophecies similar, not the same, but similar in so many different cultures. The Mayan prophecy of 2012, the Himalayan prophecy, the Buddhist prophecy, the Christian prophecy, the Jewish prophecy, the Hindu prophecy. You go on and on. Every culture has prophecies that we have entered a time in history where the portal is open for us to make some major changes, to rise to higher consciousness, to understand more about what it means to be human on this planet, to understand that we must create a more socially just, environmentally sustainable human presence on this amazing space station where we live, this planet Earth.
That's super interesting and very well put. I was thinking about yin and yang when you're describing it, and thinking about how universal some of these themes are.
Right. Yes. Very.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, I know we're getting close to the end of the time we've got. Was there anything that we didn't cover off that you wanted to mention?
Well, yeah, I could go on for days.
Yeah.
We can read the book and get it in there. Perhaps the last thought is, I think we should all feel very blessed that we live in these times, despite the hardships, despite the coronavirus and so on. But we are really learning to listen to the voice of the earth. And you can look at that scientifically, that the skies are clearing when there's not, there's not a lot of industrial activity going on. That's scientific. You can measure it. Or you can look at it like Maria Juana, the shaman, did, and say it's Pachamama, a living earth, speaking to you. It doesn't matter, but whatever it is, these messages are very, very strong. We have to change. And you and I and all your listeners are blessed to be living at this time when we can make this happen. And this coronavirus gives us an opportunity to really go into ourselves and say, hey, I can sulk and I can say I can't self-isolate any longer, or I can use this as a time to do what I've always wanted to do: learn to play the flute, learn to write a book, paint a picture, whatever it is. And so we're really living in times of extreme crisis, but also huge opportunity. And I think every one of your listeners should be grateful to live at this time and just start this daily practice to take you into it. And incidentally, you can get a workbook that helps you do that for free if you go to johnperkins.org and pre-order the book Touching the Jaguar. You'll get a workbook. We have a program once every 2 weeks, where we had a Mayan shaman on 2 weeks ago from Guatemala. It was phenomenal. And tomorrow we're doing it again Lynn Twist is going to be my guest, and she wrote the book Soul of Money. So she'll be talking about touching the Jaguar in finance and money and economics.
Fantastic. That's all great stuff. So the book's called Touching the Jaguar, and I presume you can get it anywhere and everywhere that books are sold. So
yeah,
Amazon,
you can, and
wherever else.
Yeah, so you got it. It'll be delivered in about 2 weeks, mid-June. It's when it officially comes out. You can pre-order it now, and you can go to my website, johnperkins.org, and then you can pre-order it at your own local bookstore or any of the major online vendors or wherever you want, but you can do it through there. And then when you get that information there, you can also join this Facebook group that I mentioned that we do every 2 weeks. We have amazing guest speakers, and you get a workbook, and there's a bunch of other what we call free bonuses that go along with it. Because I really want people to, I'm not about selling books so much as at all. And what I'm really about is we got to change the world. I'm 75 years old. I got a 12-year-old grandson. I'm impatient for this to move out there and get this changed away.
Fantastic. John, this was great. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me, and I'm sure my listeners will love it. Thank you so much.
Likewise, Ben. Thank you. Please keep up your great work.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, I hope you all enjoyed that. Check out John's work. Links are in the show notes as usual. And as always, drop me a note about the podcast. Let me know what you think. Offer any suggestions on future guests. All of that stuff is welcome. allthingsrisk@gmail.com is the best place to do that. Thank you for being with us. We will be back soon. Until then, and as always, don't forget, risk is life.